Video games are often seen as an escape from reality. While your life in the real world may be difficult, that all goes away when you enter the digital one. For a while, I thought this was a universal truth of playing games, at least until I played Persona 4. When I first played this game, I had expected a similar experience to Persona 5, the game which I had played prior. While some aspects were the same, the overall theme was drastically different. Instead of Persona 5's focus on dealing with outward issues like corruption in society, it was more about the self, meaning dealing with the problems inside your own mind. To truly understand what this means, we need to look at what inspired Persona 4's theme in the first place, a philosopher named Carl Jung. To keep the explanation brief, Jung developed the ideas of the self, the persona, and the shadow. To players of the game, you'll recognize the persona as the manifestation of your spirit which you use to take down shadows. In Jung's philosophy, it's similar to this idea, but a little bit more in depth. You could think of the persona in real life as the mask you wear to fit in certain scenarios. The most common example of this is the persona you use when you speak with family versus when you speak with friends. A shadow, on the other hand, is the side of you that you rather not face. The side of you that you don't want to admit is there. Everyone has personas and shadows. In fact, if you didn't have either, you'd probably act on every single intrusive thought you had. Jung actually states that the less you're aware of your own shadow, the blacker and the denser it is. So how does this tie into Persona 4? Well, the core theme of the game is facing your true self. While we all have personas, the lines between who we are and who our shadow is might be unclear. Persona 4 tries its best to interpret this concept through extremely relatable characters who all deal with childhood trauma, a major cause of shadows. Instead of trying to explain this specifically, I'm going to take you through some of the main characters of the game, and I'm sure you'll relate to some of their struggles. Oh, and spoilers, obviously. Just to make sure you remember the setting of the game, it takes place in a small town in Japan called Inaba. The main character moves here to live with some relatives and attends a brand new school. Shortly after arriving, there was a murder in the town of a girl named Saki Konishi, which sparks the protagonist and his two friends Yosuke and Chie to explore something called the TV world. This is an alternate reality inside of a television that suddenly appeared to them once the murder happened. With that, we can actually discuss the characters now. While starting with analyzing the main character might seem like a natural point to begin, I actually want to save him for last, so stick around for that. First, let's look at Yosuke Hanamura, our best friend character. On the surface, he seems like quite a stupid guy, the type to crack inappropriate jokes around girls and say stuff that makes you cringe. The class clown, if you will. If you look deeper though, there's a big reason why he acts this way to begin with. First of all, Yosuke's backstory involves him moving to Inaba from a big city environment due to his father managing the Walmart-like establishment of Juness. While this seems good, the locals are not too fond of Juness because it takes away from small businesses. Being affiliated with this controversial brand gave Yosuke the strong desire to be liked. This ends up manifesting in him doing attention-seeking things and making a fool of himself. This isn't his only problem though, because the death of Saki Konishi deeply affected him. He had feelings for her, and right when he felt like they were getting closer, she was murdered. There's not too many more traumatic things that can happen to you as a teenager than the death of a friend, so naturally he was disturbed. In fact, when he entered the TV world, his shadow was the first major fight of the game. While it's a bit hard to explain, shadows in this game manifest out of someone's deepest, darkest feelings and sentiments. Yosuke's shadow revealed that deep down he was bored of this small town and wanted to do anything to make it exciting, even if that meant others would get hurt or offended. This isn't his intention, and honestly he's barely conscious of it, but deep down that's what his shadow is representing. But after defeating the shadow, it resulted in him coming to terms with his boredom, but also understanding that acting out of his true nature and hurting others is not okay. His shadow then became a persona which he could use now to fight in the TV world. As nice as it would be for all his problems to go away, you don't just move on from seeing a friend's dead body on the news. Throughout the game, he struggles with a new issue, being the feeling of inadequacy and guilt of Saki's death. There was obviously nothing he could do, but that's not important to the mind of a teenager who had already a lot of mental turmoil. So how does he overcome this all? Well, it's a long process of understanding that being a friend to someone doesn't really mean you need to be necessarily useful. You don't need to prove yourself to your friends, and if you do, you need different friends. The next character who suffers from trauma is Kanji Tatsumi. From a young age, Kanji was bullied for his interests in traditional feminine activities like sewing and crafting. Naturally, this made him question his masculinity, eventually causing him to adopt a delinquent persona. As someone who has always been into different kinds of hobbies and dabbled into those traditional feminine ones too, I don't know. I really resonated with Kanji here. Besides this issue, he's dealing with confusion around his sexuality due to him liking someone named Naoto who is trying to act and dress like a boy, although they are not a boy, and they don't even identify as that. That's a whole nother character that I'll discuss later though. These issues around Kanji cause him to really struggle with his identity as a man, which in turn makes his shadow appear as a flamboyant and effeminate man. Some people misinterpret this shadow as his true feelings. That's incorrect. The shadow doesn't necessarily reflect someone's true feelings, but more so a distorted image of someone's potential fears or insecurities. Since Kanji is currently concerned about his masculinity and potential sexuality, his shadow is an extreme example of what he doesn't want people to view him as. Kanji's journey to overcoming this isn't instantaneous, but over time he starts to slowly move away from the tough guy act and just be normal. He begins to realize that it doesn't really matter what he likes as long as he's true to himself. And also, Naoto revealing that she is not a boy probably helped him feel a little more secure in his sexuality. While we're on the topic, let's talk about Natta Shiro. She is a female detective prodigy who presents as a male to be taken serious in her profession. There is very little indication of her having actual gender confusion or anything else like that, but rather the main issue is the immense pressure of being a teenage girl in a male-dominated profession. Naoto's shadow ends up being an extreme manifestation of this conflict. It talks about things like gender reassignment surgery being required to fit in as a detective, which Naoto obviously doesn't really want. It's just a deep, twisted inner feeling that haunts her. Being a teenager and a girl, fixing this issue is not done easily. The adults in her life have clearly traumatized her with patronizing remarks and things of that sort. After defeating her shadow, Naoto is able to take steps forward to being true to herself. She opens up to her friends about being a girl and drops her guard about being perceived as manly. Kanji and Naoto are characters a lot of people debate about being written both amazingly and poorly. However, they are often misinterpreted. If I had to guess why, it's probably because people resonate with their identity confusion and want to project their realities and traumas onto them, and hey, if that works for you, be my guest. The next character is one that is perhaps not so relatable to the masses, but is still quite interesting. Rei Kujikawa is a teenage idol who is quite famous, however, she struggles with many insecurities. Number 1, she has extreme pressure at a young age to be presentable, and number 2, she doesn't understand what value she has if not from fame and beauty. At the beginning of her character arc, she quits the entertainment industry and moves to Inaba to live a much more low-key life. Unfortunately, she gets dragged into the TV world business and is forced to face her shadow. This is perhaps the most disturbing shadow out of all of the main characters, as it is a hyper-sexualized version of herself who is attention-seeking and overall pretty slimy. If that seems disgusting, well, that's the point. Deep down, Rei doesn't want to be viewed in the way that her shadow acts. When she defeats her shadow, it's a long process for her to regain her confidence though. She actually ends up getting really clingy on the protagonist, which is a really great representation of how some people respond when they don't feel adequate. By the end of her character arc though, she realizes that she doesn't need to conform to the expectations of random people to be loved and accepted. She no longer feels like being in her idol persona is the only way to get affection. This was learned through the love her friends gave her throughout the story. By the end of it, she's able to return to her passion of show business while not being overwhelmed by the darker side of it. While there are plenty of characters to analyze in this game, there are 2 more that I want to discuss. The next is the protagonist's cousin, Nanako Dojima. Out of everyone, she has perhaps the most difficult trauma to overcome, the loss of a parent at a young age. When she was very young, her mother was run over in a hit-and-run accident. Just to make things worse, her father is unable to be fully attentive to her because of his job as a police detective. Nanako never got the parental guidance and love she needed and still needs as a child, causing her to feel super isolated. Since she's young, she doesn't really understand why her father can't be there all the time, and sometimes that makes her think that he doesn't love her. In reality, he's trying his best to provide for the family while still spending some time with her. During the game, the protagonist lives with Nanako and they become close, almost like siblings. This is Nanako's first experience with a family member that is actually present in her day-to-day life. Eventually though, Nanako is dragged into the TV world, but since she's such a young child, she doesn't have a shadow. Nanako. Instead, she gets even more traumatized by being kidnapped and eventually hospitalized. Nanako's path to recovery begins once her father realizes how important his role in keeping her safe is. She is able to learn how to express her needs to him, and he is more open to being there in her time of need. As for dealing with her mother's death, it's one of those things that's never going to fully heal. However, she comes to terms with it and does not let it get in the way of all the love she has right now. Nanako could be considered an example of how childhood trauma happens in the moment and what parents and others in their life can do to help them through it. Finally, let's talk about the protagonist. The reason I wanted to save him for last is because there are plenty of different interpretations of what he deals with. His backstory is not very complicated, but he moves in from the big city to Inaba due to his parents' work. Whether or not this is traumatizing for him is impossible to know, but it at least probably makes him feel uneasy having to transfer to a brand new school where he doesn't know anybody. I know that in my life, I've moved across the country several times, and it certainly is not the easiest thing to lose your closest friends and never be able to see them again. Over the course of the game, the protagonist takes the responsibility of being the group leader when they enter the TV world. This is a lot of responsibility since they are literally fighting for their lives. Besides that though, there's no clear trauma that he has that really seems to be plaguing him, and well, I believe that's intentional. A lot of people think that childhood trauma comes from specific events happening, and while this is also true, there is another way that they can develop. Imagine you're a kid with really strict parents who force you into a certain hobby, let's say piano, and then say you're forced to play piano for 4 hours a day after school every single day, or else you'll face your mother's wrath or something. This is certainly traumatic, but not because of one single moment. Now imagine you're the protagonist of Persona 4, forced to move into a drastically different environment than what you're used to, then suddenly you're given the responsibility to solve a murder mystery and essentially save the world. And keep in mind, you're like 15 years old. Every single time you enter the TV world, you have to make sure that none of your friends get hurt while you never get a chance to take a break. Not to mention being in the middle of the school year, which requires a lot of focus in and of itself. At a glance, this might seem cool, but realistically, that's a lot of pressure for a teenager. I understand that the protagonist is meant to be a self-insert type of character though, so I believe that the solutions to his problems are meant to be able to be applied to the masses. The way he overcomes this immense pressure is actually through the bonds that he has with his friends. At the end of the day, no matter your situation, the people closest to you are often the reasons why you're able to get through troubles. Whether it's because of advice they give you or simply just their presence, you're almost always stronger when you have close friends by your side. I love the Persona 4 protagonist because while he does have a unique personality, he is still able to be a perfect self-insert for the player. We are able to use his strength in the game as a way of inspiring us in the real world. Persona 4 has a lot of great points relating to trauma and how the kids in the game overcome it. There are also many characters I didn't mention in the video that would likely be relatable to some of you. That's what I love so much about games like this though. There's really something for everyone to latch onto. Other than the fun gameplay and amazing music, the writing of the characters in Persona 4 is some of the best I've ever seen in gaming.